Yeah, so I approached it sort of with in kind of with two things in mind. One is that growing up in Mississauga, it was a frequent kind of bit for my imagination or a kind of inspiration for me and my creativity when I was young to often go on walks and to explore the parks and the green spaces of the city. That's why it's been such a foundation of the work that I've done, whether it was the poem for the Mayor's New Year's Levy or this one, or running like the hike and write workshop, which is an outdoor thing I did last fall. I've always been kind of fascinated with the green spaces of the city and various capacities of those. So I wanted to center it around that, and that's kind of why the project took form in a way that it was panels of poetry installed along the Burnhamthorpe Trail. So it was kind of poetry brought into those spaces that I found so inspiring. So it was a nice kind of mix of or a meeting of the inspiration and the work that was created. So that was sort of the genesis of at the heart of it. More specifically, when we get into the actual poems and the way that they're written, one thing that when I was younger and writing poetry, I was kind of all free verse, and I still am, very free in how I approach verse structure. But as I've gotten more enamored and deep into the craft, I think I've paid more attention to the history and the development and the styles and meters of poetry that have been used by both previous poets working in English as well as poets from around the world. And when I was approaching then the poems themselves, I decided to kind of base each one around a different kind of structure or style. So some of them use like tanka and haiku, which come from the Japanese tradition. Others use something called dactylic hexameter in a sort of way, which was used in old epics like the Iliad, Odyssey, the Aeneid, things like that. Other ones were based off things like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the original poem, which uses alliteration and then a certain kind of thing called bob and wheel, which is actually on your screen right now. So if you look at your screen right now, two things there are that each of the lines in the first bit are alliterative, which means they use at least two or three instances of the same sound at the beginnings of the words. So the first line, M, my, memory, make, be, will do that. The second thing you'll notice is that in each of the lines in the first bit, there's a kind of divide halfway, either through a comma, a conjoining word like or and that's called what's called a Cesura, which is where each line is divided into two and has two kind of halves. So in the first one, if my memory fades, make me walk the trail, or two things divided by or. This is something you see also in like Beowulf and a lot of old Anglo-Saxon poetry. If you look at the bottom, there is a kind of rhyme scheme between feeling, imagination shape the reality of my whole being in ways that are a scarcity after maturing. A-B, A-B-A. And that's what you'll find if you read the original of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight poem. Each stanza ends with that little rhyming bit after the alliteration, which creates the kind of musicality. So I was kind of focused on the technique as well. So that's what happened with this one. Other ones use different ones. This is the dactylic hexameter, which means that generally speaking, it's groups of 3 syllables with 6 of those groupings per line. The only thing that's different is that a dactyl has a certain level of stresses. I don't use those exactly. I'm a bit more free with them. But the idea of grouping each line as 6 groups of 3 syllables is kind of what came in there. And so I used those as a jumping off point as I composed these poems. So that was a little bit long, but that's the answer to kind of how I approached both the content as well as the idea itself of the poem, of all the projects. So first thing, we walked the site or the trail where the project was going to be put in ourselves. And we took a look around and ideas that we had, and I talked about, you know, ideas that I had forming, and she talked about some of hers, and we looked at the different sites and what was around them, and kind of took in the experience of what it would be like for the people coming through the park or through the trail and viewing the poem. Um, Beyond that, we did talk about it that way. We did create a little bit in our own to our own volition. I wrote sort of drafts of the poems, sent them to Hiba. Hiba made creations and designs, showed them to me, and we kind of worked back and forth like that. Yeah, that was a really nice thing because it was really exciting seeing the things that she put together for the works. And there were a few comments back and forth, you know, as we collaborated and polished it.
I think what was so fascinating for me working with Paul on this is like I've never worked with a poet, and to me it's like there's text-based artists, but then there's poets. Like they it's like a different kind of craft. I mean, all around the idea of language, but I think that my experience of language and text is so spatial. And especially in some of these examples that you have up, they're really relative to space. I work so much in public space. I also work so much with others. And I think that collaborating with different communities or other artists or, you know, creative practitioners, it's always about communication. And so it became this very kind of natural progression for me to also communicate in language. And I think that as a text-based artist, one of the things I really enjoy is that it can be very direct, the way that you're communicating with a public, especially if the work is a public artwork. Or it can also be extremely poetic and maybe symbolic and less clear as to what it is, and you kind of leave it up to the interpretation of the viewer or the person who's passing by. And I really like that kind of flexibility that text-based art allows. So I think that working with Paul was a real challenge because it really pushed my skills in understanding the visual landscape a lot more, and also having to interpret his words, which were not my own. And so it was a very, very interesting process to kind of go through that with him. Like he was mentioning, like we walked the trail together. I also went back a few times myself and really kind of looked at some of the signs and markers of what I was noticing as I was walking, you know, and then trying to figure out how that connects with Paul's poems, because some of them reference really specific places in Mississauga, like Tompkin Road, for instance. But then some of them also reference things like water and creeks and certain temperatures. And so I was trying to seek out those places on Burnhamthorpe Trail to see if there was a way that we could kind of have it connect to the physical space that it would be in. Kind of did. I think overall, I think walking the trail gave me a sense of like that space and what it looked like. And then I made these designs based more so specifically on the poems themselves, and then figured out where each one should go based on that kind of relationship that was formed. And I think it turned out in a really kind of interesting way. I also like that it ended up kind of spanning 4 kilometers, because it's not, it's, you kind of happen upon them. It's not like you might necessarily see them all in one walk. I mean, of course, some of us like to walk for a long time, but it's not like they're boom, 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 boom right next to each other. And so there's an intimacy to that that I was thinking about as well, because the scale of them, they're quite like 1 to 1. It's not like, you know, 50 people are gonna be able to see it at once. It's kind of like a one person reading it at a time. So I wanted to also like pay homage to that that part of the poems that are really special, which is you kind of happen upon them on your walks.
Mhm. So I have to ask because this is one of my favorites. If you see the top lines of this poem were accelerating wheels of time show how two minds, and it's installed right above a stop sign and a bicycle. So there's a really interesting relationship between the words there, conceptually and spatially. Is that something that you took into consideration as you were planning the location for each of these signs?
Yeah, I think so, because like, I mean, there's another one too that has this really beautiful connection to the trees that are in the space. They actually match the design that's on the poems. Yeah, this one, right?
Mhm.
So it's really like an echo of the space. And I think that, in the one that you were just pointing out, Rachel, I really like that when you're making public artwork, you have to face all of the other interference that's happening in that space. And I think that sometimes it can be like humorous and kind of funny, but also it can also just make the work amplify in this way where it makes you kind of think even beyond what you're just reading, and become really spatially aware of like where your body is in that moment. And so for me, it was very, I mean, in relationship to my own practice, very on brand to kind of have a poem that's talking about acceleration next to a traffic space, as well as a stop sign, as well as where cyclists are going through. And there's another sign that says no trucks. It's like a very kind of interesting space to have these types of words appear in.
Well, and it's so interesting because it takes this informational text and almost adds a poetic spin to it. So now
Right.
cyclists dismount feels like poetry being located next to a poem,
Exactly.
which is a
Yeah.
really
And
interesting way to view the landscape.
for sure. And I mean, with the example of this poem, for instance, it's right above a creek. So it's really interesting to see the sign above it say cyclists dismount, which obviously is in reference to like the safety of that area. But for me, cyclists dismounting and slowing down, they actually get to see the water below, which is like in reference to this poem. And so it becomes a different type of relationship in that space.
Around it. I always knew they'd be on, posts and things like that, but I think I'd almost forgotten in my mind that these posts will have other things on them as well. But it also serves as a way of questioning or pushing or breaking down that barrier between kind of found words as well as specifically composed text. And in terms of like found poetry and things like that, that's done that, or samples and music, that's been something that's been explored. And I didn't expect it to come into play here, but you're right that it absolutely does, because poetry or poetic turns of phrase are used sort of, are used all over. I mean, just this past year, when I was teaching grade 12, one of the literary devices that came up was called a chiasmus, which was one that's where you have a phrase and then an inversion of the phrase, so it becomes symmetrical. Like if you fail to prepare, then you're preparing to fail. Or if you had like, but even if you went to things like jingles, like, I'm stuck on Band-Aids because Band-Aids stuck on me. You said you have these poetic techniques that get turned not just into art, like song lyrics, poetry, but, advertising, or be it, public signs and displays that use that also. And by putting a poem next to it, it kind of questions and makes you, kind of raises that kind of Dadaist question of like, what is the art?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always an interesting question, especially when it comes to public art. I think that I hope people take away whatever they want from it, but in terms of experiencing it, I really hope that it kind of sparks a certain type of curiosity to to be really curious about the space and the places that we occupy. Um, and that there's surprises that come up in the least expecting ways. This public artwork is by no means like kind of a mega sign that you can't really miss. It's very small, it's very intimate, but the poems themselves are so beautiful and profound, and so it's almost like a little gift that you get if you find them or if you see them. And so I think that I would hope that people feel like, oh, I wonder what else I can find in my city or what else I can see, and have that encourage them to explore more their own neighborhoods, their own spaces with different eyes.
I'm not so much as interested in trying to dictate or tell people, how they should be inspired. So I think I'm with Hiba in terms of the idea that people can take what they will. But I think through my poetry, like there are certain city-centric ones here. But other ones are not, are more kind of metaphorical or symbolic or mythological or nature-based. And I think what I've been trying to point out, or trying to do, is lead by example, and that's show people that whatever your inspiration is, you can find a way to hopefully make it work and hopefully still practice that. There tends to be a view that, poetry has to be this one kind of narrow thing. It has to be, either pretty, or it has to be something. There's always preset ideas, and the idea that I think I want to show people that you can take it whatever way you want. Some of these are more supernatural based, and some people are more into ghost stories and horror fiction. And I don't. And if people are into things that are different or surreal, I don't want those people to feel like they have no place in, public art or the city. This is maybe a tendency to think that everything has to be, positive vibes only and all that kind of stuff like that. But the idea, especially as we've all collectively gone through such, difficult times with COVID, there's an importance to acknowledge the variety of experience. And yes, I think to boil it down, the poems, I'm trying to show that, poetry can work on multiple angles. It can be more traditional, it can be more experimental, it can be more current, it can be more directly about the present age, nonfiction, it can be more fictional or symbolic. And I think I just want to show that, poetry, as it works with the city, with public space, doesn't have to just be, positive vibes only kind of thing. It can show the diversity of experience.